Welcome aboard from the cockpit. Today's tour has us in the Ukraine. We are going to tour the site of the world's worst nuclear disaster. Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, 1986, Reactor 4 explodes, still radioactive today, so don those radioactive suits, find a seat, buckle up. We're going to tour Chernobyl today. I'm going to put you in the trusty hands of my co-pilot while I set up the cockpit, get the plane started, and get us in the air so we can do some touring over the radioactive area of Chernobyl. Small airstrip not too far from Chernobyl. I think the name of it is Linya. Probably said that wrong, but not much of an airstrip at all. That's about it. Ukraine at the time was part of the former Soviet Union. Not much to see here, folks. Let's get the plane in the air.
Uniform Kilo Sierra Lima traffic dude 001 is taxiing to runway 34.
Welcome aboard the tour today, people. I'm your co-pilot and tour guide. As the pilot said, today we are going to do some touring around the Ukraine, the areas of Chernobyl and Pripyat, the area where, or most affected by, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Very small airstrip here today, folks, so we may be using the airstrip along with some grass for both our departure and landing, since it looks pretty small. And we are in, today we're back in the Cessna Grand Caravan, the 208B.
Uniform Kilo Sierra Lima traffic dude 001 taking off runway 34 for departure to the north.
Today's tour is going to take us over the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. It's in the north of the Ukraine. And on Saturday, the 26th of April, 1986, reactor number 4 was the site of the world's worst nuclear disaster. Not much of runway there. The Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant is located about 81 miles, 130 kilometers north of the city of Kiev, Ukraine, and about 12 miles south of the border with Belarus. It's made up of 4 reactors that were designed and built during the 1970s and the 1980s. It has a man-made reservoir that we'll fly over that's roughly 8.5 square miles, and it's fed by the Pripyat River, and that provides the cooling water for the reactors. At the time, the newly built city of Pripyat was the nearest town to the power plant, at just under 2 miles away, and it housed almost 50,000 people. There's the smaller and older town of Chernobyl, which is about 9 miles away, and at the time that was home to about 12,000 residents. And then the remainder of the region, as we will see to this day as we fly over it, was mostly farms and woodland. The accident at the Chernobyl plant happened during a safety test of one of the reactors. The test was to simulate electrical power outage so that they could come up with safety procedures for maintaining reactor cooling water circulation following an outage. So after the outage and until the backup electrical generators could provide power, there's a gap. And it's about 1 minute, and this had been identified as a potential safety problem that would cause the nuclear reactor core to overheat, and that, of course, is a bad thing. So what they hoped to prove during this test was that the residual rotational energy of a turbine could provide enough power to cover this gap between the power going out and the emergency power kicking in. So based on the tour today being the worst nuclear disaster, you can imagine what happened with the test during this gap. A few things happened that led to this disaster, one of them being that the test was delayed 10 hours, which meant that the original reactor staff that was meant to perform the test was replaced by another shift that wasn't prepared for the test. So for the test on Reactor 4, the reactor was put in a decreased power mode, but what happened was it unexpectedly dropped to near zero. So then when the operators were able to partially restore the test power, they continued with the test, but the operators were unaware that it had put the reactor in an unstable condition. So they proceeded with the test, and then when the test was complete, they triggered what should have been a normal reactor shutdown. But the combination of this unstable condition, along with some later determined design flaws with the reactor, it caused an uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction. And yes, folks, that's a bad thing. So with that chain reaction, a large amount of energy was suddenly released, and it vaporized superheated cooling water, which then ruptured the reactor core, and a highly destructive steam explosion occurred. Again, a bad thing. So this was immediately followed by an open-air reactor core fire. Please, again, note that's a bad thing. That released a considerable amount of airborne radioactive contamination, and that lasted for about 9 to 10 days. So this radiation then rained down on parts of what was the former USSR and parts of Western Europe, and especially Belarus, where about 70% of the radioactive debris did land. The explosion killed 2 plant workers immediately, and then there was several other workers that died within hours of the accident. But then over the next several days, as emergency crews tried to contain the fire and the radiation leaks, of course the death toll climbed as both the plant workers and the first responders succumbed to acute radiation sickness. I mean, the initial fire was put out by about 5 a.m. the next day, but the resulting graphite-fueled fire took 10 more days to extinguish it. The toxic emission continued to be pumped into the atmosphere for, as I said, up to 10 days after the initial event. The escaping debris and radiation was finally contained on 4 May 1986, and as a result of the rising radiation levels around the site, a 6.2 mile or 10 kilometer radius exclusion zone was created 36 hours after the accident, and about 49,600 people were evacuated from the immediate area, primarily from Pripyat, but the exclusion zone was later increased to 19 miles or 30 kilometer radius, and another 68,000 people were evacuated from that wider area. As you'll see on our flight plan here shown on our multifunctional display, we are tracking straight towards Chernobyl. We should approach a body of water, and it'll be just on the far side of the water. We'll take her off autopilot, do some hand flying here, see if we can get down closer to what we're touring today. As we fly over this water here, you'll see that the power plant's going to be right across this water, and you'll see on our left it's the location of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. The structure on our left is the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. Note that after a few weeks after the accident, crews completely covered the damaged reactor with a temporary concrete structure called the sarcophagus, so to limit further release of radioactive material. The Soviet government also cut down the trees that were here and buried them for like a square mile of pine forest around the plant to reduce the radioactive contamination near the site. The other reactors here that were flying over actually got restarted eventually and ran for quite some time, but were all eventually shut down. The last reactor closed in 1999. Flying over the towns near the plant here. So the residents at the neighboring workers' town of Pripyat weren't told of the deadly radiation covering their homes at first, but as official buses began evacuating the area, people were instructed to just bring a suitcase, that they'd be able to return to their houses in just a few days. But as the extent of the explosion became clear, the Soviet military established the official exclusion zone, and about 115,000 people were evacuated that year in 1986, and about another 220,000 in the following years, which created, this desolate landscape of abandoned towns and villages. In addition to the immediate deaths, of course, there were many deaths that followed on, so they claim that determining the total eventual number of exposure-related deaths is uncertain, but based on some models, the eventual total death toll in the decades that followed Chernobyl could be anywhere from 4,000 fatalities to 16,000 fatalities when you consider the total continent of Europe. So in recent years, the deterioration of the original sarcophagus, which obviously was built in a hasty manner to contain the reactor, started to deteriorate and break down. So that resulted in a new enclosure having to be designed and was actually installed in 2017. So this new, larger enclosure actually allows for the removal of both the original enclosure and the reactor debris while containing the radioactive hazard. So if you are interested in how they were able to get the other reactors back online and working, they somewhat contained reactor number 4, but that didn't allow for anybody to move back into the exclusion zone. The radiation has lasted, pretty much until this day. Following the accident, there was a 3-week trial in what they called a makeshift courthouse in the town of Chernobyl, which was only 11 miles from the crippled reactor. And during that trial, the people that were responsible for the accident were tried and sentenced. Viktor Brukhanov, the former plant director, received the maximum penalty of 10 years of deprivation of freedom. He was found guilty of gross violation of safety rules and criminal negligence in connection with the catastrophe. He was singled out as the chief culprit in the world's worst atomic energy accident. Also received a 5-year sentence for abuse of power, and that sentence ran concurrent with the 10-year sentence. The former chief engineer Nikola Fomin and his deputy Anatoly Dailatov received 10-year sentences for their roles in this accident. Boris Rogishkin, the shift chief at the plant's 4th reactor where the explosion took place, was given 5 years in an ordinary corrective labor camp. Ordinary corrective labor camp, not to be confused with an unordinary corrective labor camp, I guess. The reactor chief, Alexander Kovalenko, was sentenced to 3 years, and senior engineer Yuri Lashkin served 2 years in a similar labor camp. Looks like we're a little over 3 minutes out from the airport, if you want to call that small airstrip an airport. So hopefully be on the ground soon. Hopefully we didn't absorb too much radiation. Today, the region within this exclusion zone, or it's sometimes called the zone of alienation, is filled with a variety of wildlife, I guess now that the people pretty much are gone. And this wildlife has thrived without interference from humans. There are what they say is thriving populations of wolves, deer, lynx, beavers, eagles, boar, elk, bears, and other animals. And the area has recovered to some extent, but is far from returning to normal. And tourism's a thing there. So tourists continue to visit the site of Chernobyl, and I think it's thanks to an HBO series based on the disaster. Chernobyl was a 2019 historical drama television miniseries that revolves around the Chernobyl disaster and the cleanup efforts that followed. The exclusion zone is technically still strictly off limits, and the area obviously remains a reminder of what a nuclear disaster can do. And tourist entry into the exclusion zone is only permitted with a licensed guide, so there are many areas inside the exclusion zone that are still considered very, very dangerous. But there are guides that will, I guess, have the expertise to keep you safe while you tour the Chernobyl area, the abandoned towns and villages. And there's even a hotel within the exclusion zone. It's a simple hotel that people describe as a Soviet-style hotel. And according to the website, visitors are provided with an iron-starched linen, which is stamped by the Chernobyl Special Industrial Complex. And they claim there's even Wi-Fi at this hotel, so if you're there visiting and exploring, you can check in with your friends on social media and email that you're deep inside the exclusion zone. Other than the Ukraine, the country of Belarus was the most affected country in the Chernobyl incident. About 70% of all the radioactive fallout from Chernobyl landed in Belarus. It contaminated 1/4 of the country, it contaminated 1/5 of its agricultural land, and it affected at least 7 million people. More than 2,000 towns and villages were evacuated in Belarus, and about 500,000 people have been relocated since 1986. Well, we're almost back to where we started. We're going to land at one of the two small airstrips here in northern Ukraine. The one we're going to land at is fairly small, so it's time to find your seats, buckle up, store your luggage. Hope you enjoyed today's tour. We have a lot of tours coming up, so make sure you book your seats for future tours, and if you have any ideas for places you'd like to visit, absolutely let us know.
Moscow television tonight.
От Совета министров СССР. На Чернобыльской атомной электростанции произошла авария. Поврежден один из атомных реакторов.
For the first time ever, the Soviet Union admits it has had a nuclear accident, and it's clearly a major one.
It's almost certainly the most severe accident that has ever taken place in the short history of civilian nuclear power.
Good evening, I'm Ted Koppel, and this is Nightline. It seems virtually certain that what the Soviets have experienced is a nuclear meltdown. How serious and far-reaching would the effects be?
Welcome to the ground somewhere in the Ukraine. Wonderful Ukrainian sunset out there. Hope you enjoyed the tour today. Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. See if we can find a wonderful place to stay out here for the night. Looks like we might be in the middle of nowhere. This is even smaller than the little strip we took off from. But we're down. Hope you had a good time. If you have any ideas for good places to fly to on our next tour, please leave them in a comment below. I'm going to shut this Cessna Grand Caravan down, park it for the night. Maybe I'll end up staying in that little house that's behind us. Who knows? Well, I will see you on the next tour.